Good afternoon, everyone. I can see people streaming in. Thanks for joining us. We'll wait just 1 or 2 more minutes as people enter, and then I will open the session formally. Thanks. Thanks, Alice, for getting the ball rolling in the chat. Yeah, if anyone would like to introduce themselves, where you're coming from, what organization, or just where on the planet you are, that would be great. And as I said, we're just going to wait a couple more minutes for more people to join, and then we'll get started. All right, I think I will get going. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the second day of the Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival 2021. I hope that many of you were able to attend our plenary discussion and film screening yesterday, where we reflected on economics and the COVID-19 crisis 1 year later. My name is Katrina Lehman-Gruber, and I will be your facilitator today. I'm a climate justice researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, and so I'm particularly excited to have the opportunity to be facilitating on this topic and with this group of people. The session today is part of the second theme of REFA, which is Economics After the Crisis, Emerging Trends in Economic Thinking. And we will be discussing ecological perspectives on a post-COVID world with our 3 distinguished speakers. So in some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call regarding our environmental and climate crises. It has both been described as foreshadowing of future crises, as well as an economic opportunity to rethink the way that we build back and fundamentally change the way our economy works. On the other hand, particularly in places like South Africa, where the pandemic has worsened existing crises of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, climate change and environmental problems may seem like something very far down the list of priorities. So in this session, we will hopefully unpack some of this thinking a little bit more with the help of our 3 experts. I will, in terms of the format of the session, I will introduce all the speakers up front. They will then each have a maximum of 15 minutes to speak. And after they've all gone, I'll open the floor up for discussion and questions. In the meantime, please do make use of the Q&A function at the bottom to ask questions. And if you're asking a question to someone in particular, please indicate so. Otherwise, during the question and answer session, you can also raise your hand and use the chat function for any comments or any technical problems that you're having. So, our great panelists. I'll first be introducing Dr. Richard Munang. He is currently the African Regional Climate Change Coordinator for the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, and last year received the Africa Green Climate Champion Award. He has been active in developing the continent's climate change policy over the last 16 years and is extremely widely published on this topic. Welcome, Richard. Next, we have Dr. Gregor Semieniuk. He is currently an assistant research professor at the Political Economy Research Institute and Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research focuses on energy and resource requirements for economic growth and the political economy of structural change in the transition to a low carbon economy. Welcome, Gregor. And then lastly, we have Tyler Booth, who was able to jump in the last minute as our original panelist, unfortunately could not make it. But we're very pleased to have Tyler here, as she is currently the project lead for the South African Youth Climate Action Plan, which is being convened through the youth programs of the South African Institute for International Affairs. She's an experienced climate change activist, having attended COP25 and leading the climate change working group of the Youth Policy Committee. So welcome to them all, and welcome to all the attendees. We're really, really pleased to have you. I will hand the floor over to Richard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and to those who are joining in. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion today, coming at a time which over 3 weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel released the assessment report, which showed that the world was actually headed towards a cataclysmic point. But let me start off with an African proverb, which tells us that it is better that trials come to you in the beginning, and you find peace afterwards, than for them to come to you at the end. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this African proverb aptly contextualizes the core of building resilience, which can be summarized in simple terms like anticipation, readiness, and early preparation. At no time has this reality dawned on the African continent, more than the past year. As I said, 3 weeks ago, the IPCC published a 2001 report whose findings have been described in some quarters as apocalyptic. According to this analysis, the globe is on track to breach the 1.5-degree warming threshold in just 2 decades from today. For Africa, a region that is already heating up twice as fast as the rest of the globe, and with 20 countries already warming faster than the globe, this means that the safe threshold of 1.5 degree will be breached faster in Africa than in any other region. This development carries their consequences. The GDP drop of up to 15% that was originally forecast to happen in 2030, and shrinkage of incomes by up to 75% that was projected by 2100 as a result of climate change will move much closer to the present. And with this, the escalation of socioeconomic misery that is already at breaking point is therefore guaranteed for the continent. Be it food insecurity, where climate change is already lowering the nutritional value of food and costing the continent up to 16% of GDP, or youth unemployment, where the continent faces an uphill task of creating over 12 million jobs each and every year for its youth, to health, where in addition to declining nutritional value of food, which is the first line of defense against infections, the temperature and precipitation variability is already causing a surge in vector-borne diseases like malaria, where Africa already carries up to 93% of annual global malaria deaths. But this escalation of vulnerability is not complete without addressing climate change impacts on infrastructure development. For example, flooding costs anywhere between 10 billion to 9% of GDP in destroyed infrastructure costs annually in some of the most impacted countries across the continent. These losses compound progress in bridging critical economic productivity. Infrastructure needs such as energy, where Africa urgently needs to ensure access to power for its 620 million people who are energy impoverished. But climate change is only one red flag. Throughout 2020 to date, the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked havoc on economies globally, including in the continent. But just as an insightful African proverb reminds us, if you carry one end of the stick, you also carry the other. This devastation and the responses fostered by different countries has served to expose Africa's urgent need for resilient economies. Across the globe, different countries in demonstration of resilience are offering multiple rounds of stimulus packages. Cumulatively, It is estimated that an excess of 12 trillion US dollars, equivalent to 12% of global GDP, was issued in stimulus packages. Other estimates that developed countries assess up to 17 trillion in credit lines to fund diverse stimulus packages. This was affordable because this credit was accessible at an interest rate as low as zero in some cases. So what's the point? The same convenience that was available to other countries was not available to Africa, a region whose needs were pegged at 100 billion in the emergency stimulus. This predicament underscores the low productivity of African economies that makes them high-risk market for debt capital. The reality of minimal value addition as we speak today, where the proportion of manufacturing value added has stagnated at an average of just 10% of GDP since the 1970s, has come to bite the continent at an hour of need. The over-reliance on commodity exports without value addition, where negative price shocks directly reduce government revenues and fiscal space, is biting Africa. Under the changing climate, which we are already seeing across the continent, Africa needs a different economic model. It needs a different model of economic productivity where a whole of society approach is leveraged. Studies show that human capital, which is the cumulative ability of citizens to turn challenges into competitive enterprise opportunities that can fetch a premium in domestic, continental, and global market, is 15 times the value of natural capital and 4 times the value of produced capital. A productive citizenry is therefore the bedrock of productive economies, and how well public resources are invested to nurture such a population provides the best indicator of how productive our economies can be under the changing climate. But we must first ask this question: where these people are engaged right now? Where are they engaged right now? Over 80% of the productive population in the African continent is engaged in the informal sector. The story of Africa is incomplete without the informal sector, because this sector is actually the chassis on which our economic locomotion strives. It employs a large number of people in the rural and urban areas, and many of them depend on the agro sector, which employs over 60% of the population. Powering, therefore, Africa into inclusive, productive, resilient economic growth cannot successfully happen without the informal sector. And leveraging this sector to create inclusive economic opportunities is our own fierce urgency of now. And therefore, we must be able to leverage climate action solutions, and the following 3 tenets that I'll leave you with are some ways in which we can move forward to build ecological resilience as well as economic resilience. And the first is, we must prioritize growing the economy, not distributing its proceeds. Africa's budgetary expenditure continues to rise, but in recurrent expenditure, not in areas that can catalyze more opportunities. Just to give an example, in the climate action area, it is estimated that Africa already spent up to 20% of its total adaptation needs annually, which amounts to $3 billion US. But the big problem is that this money goes into social expenditure. The urgent need is to ensure these expenditures go into investment areas that can offer a return in economic and financial dividend, in addition to the traditional social benefits. An urgent paradigm shift in budgetary allocation, where significant investments are directed at productive investments that directly empowers the citizens to establish enterprises that deliver competitive solutions to the continent. A practical example from the work we are doing, using the $3 billion currently expended in adaptation as a physical instrument, such as cash guarantees, to enable local cooperatives to offer low interest loans to informal sector who invest in climate action solutions, such as simple solar dryers to cut post-harvest losses that cost the continent for the 8 billion, can convert these into incomes and food secured homes, and will go a long way in building resilience. It will then mean that the $48 billion US in post-harvest losses that Africa faces each and every year are converted into competitive enterprises that generate incomes for households to build resilience. At the height of COVID, what we saw across the continent through the work we do, control measures necessitated the closure of open-air informal food markets, resulting in an increase in losses in the stock of perishable. We saw this by up to 50% in some cases, which was the highest globally. These informal food markets supply up to 90% of fresh produce in African cities. However, decentralizing simple climate action solutions, what we saw was that this proved effective and actually reduce the losses and increase revenue of informal market traders who deal in perishable by up to 30 times. Cooperatives were leveraged, and therefore cooperatives incentivized to offer investment loans to enable these informal traders to assess such effective climate action solutions can go a long way in preserving capital and catalyzing income growth among this critical population whose impact over time is inclusive economic growth and competitiveness from the bottom up that includes most of the population. And that takes me to the second point. We cannot ignore the powerhouse of Africa, our youth. The continent of Africa, over 60% of Africa's population is youthful, and therefore youth skills retooling is paramount. The young people constitute 60% of the population, and up to 80% of these young people find work in the informal sector. How these youth can be tapped to become drivers of economic competitiveness is critical. Improving, refining, and adapting their skills, regardless of their backgrounds, to align with tapping economic opportunities in the continent is critical. Through an incubation approach we developed called innovative volunteerism, we are structurally guiding young people and inspiring them to find and turn their passion into profits and retool their skills in developing climate action solutions as they decentralize these solutions that address on-demand challenges in communities. What we are seeing is that these young people are fabricating solar dryers and decentralizing them to communities, to mothers to be able to add value and reduce the post-harvest losses that are happening. We are seeing them recovering agricultural waste, turning them into fuel briquettes to replace charcoal, that actually costing the lives of 600,000 Africans each and every year. These young people are also sharing their experiences and lessons online to influence more youth to take up innovative volunteerism to bring climate action impact to scale. That takes me to the third point. Targeted incentives, especially physical incentives and non-policy incentives, are important. Favorable physical policies play a significant role in shifting market behavior. Yes, that we know. And investments from one area to another. An example to illustrate, if you take East African Kenya, for example, where I'm speaking from today, a physical policy incentive expending value-added tax on LPGs led to a significant behavioral change, where consumers and producers in the market towards favoring this LPG actually saw an increase, not only in people investing in this area of liquid petroleum gas, but actually resulted in so many people to consume it because it created a favorable space for people to be able to invest in this area. These targeted physical incentives can go a long way in shifting both the consumer market as well as entrepreneurs in the informal sector to be able to take this up. So if this is applied in simple climate action solutions of solar dryers, that will incentivize the informal sector to pick this up, incentivize young people to get into developing these climate action solutions, exempting this value added.
You have 2 minutes left. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, thank you very much. In addition to these physical incentives, what is important is that incentives alone will not be able to actually bring change. What is needed is a mindset change where everybody is inspired, especially the young people, to usher themselves to action. If we do that, then we can be able to build resilient economies in the midst of emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And yeah, bang on time. Yeah, you really provided us with the continental perspective, and I particularly appreciate the fact that you've linked it to so many of the other topics that we are covering at REFA: commodity dependence, debt, the informal sector. So yeah, that's a little advertisement to also attend some of the other sessions. I will now hand over to Gregor. You have 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks very much. It's going to be very hard to deliver something that resembles the interesting remarks that Richard just gave, but I'll try, and I'll give you a little bit more of a bird's eye perspective, although it'll really connect to some of the things that Richard just raised. So I'll try to make the connections. I've given my remarks a title, Fast Structural Change in an Uneven World. And let me elaborate what I mean by that. First, I want to confront you with a few facts, and then I want to critique current economic models that are marshaled to, to understand how we should operate in this world post-COVID and pre the worst impacts of climate change that are predicted, although we already feel them now, as Richard explained just now. And some of us may actually be realizing or experiencing as we speak that the weather and the climate is changing. So here are the facts. We currently hear a lot of superlative changes from 2020 to 2021. GDP goes up, all sorts of things go up, but that's not surprising because of course they fell from 2019 to 2020. And I want to look at change in energy consumption. This is a very useful chart from the International Energy Agency, always puts out a very helpful analyses of the latest data of around all sorts of energy, which is of course key for mitigating climate change because it has to be decarbonized. Now, what you can see here is that GDP, they predict actually, because 2021 hasn't of course passed yet, to be larger at the end at the global scale than in 2019, which is on the left-hand side here after falling in 2020. And energy demand is actually supposed to grow as well. Okay, so this is the IEA just trying to understand what's currently going on in the world economy. Why is energy demand growing? Well, because economic activity has picked back up. And, you need, for instance, solar dryers, which use solar energy to bring certain goods to market. So lots of economic activity picking up also in transport and so on. So global energy demand is growing. Now we can break this down again from the IEA into regions of the world. And what you see here is a slightly complicated graph. On the one hand, you have on the y-axis, you actually have the change in energy demand from 2019 to 2020. And if you're below the horizontal line, that means that energy demand fell. Again, really important for economic activity and well-being. So a fall in energy demand means there's typically a recession. So we see a recession basically in all of the world in all the regions of the world in 2020, except China, which, as we all know, really had hardly any COVID outbreaks after those initial ones in the first quarter of 2020. And so they actually increased also energy demand as they did economic activity in 2020 relative to 2019. Now, the interesting thing is that on the x-axis, we see again the cumulative change from 2019 to 2020. And here we see once again that, some parts of the world actually stay below the 2019 level, but most parts of the world and the world as a whole, as we saw in the previous graph, grow. And it's not so surprising to see that, right? Basically, you have rich countries declining their energy demand in line with their attempts to mitigate climate change and, switching from one energy source to another, which is more efficient. So declining energy demand is almost a byproduct simply of switching that. This is all primary energy demand for the experts among you. But the rest of the world is increasing its energy demand, as is, it's kind of almost a stylized fact of development economics. If you want to grow economically, you better have access to a lot of cheap energy. So these are the facts I want to confront you with. The world is increasing its energy demand, and the developing regions in the world, a fortiori are increasing their energy demand. Now, this is what the IPCC tells us on my next slide should happen in order to mitigate climate change. Now, the IPCC just reviews a bunch of models, right? It's not making these models themselves, but, it kind of sanctions them. And this is what, basically the experts tell the world what can be done to mitigate climate change. Again, a complicated graph with shameless self-promotion. My colleagues and I produced these graphs by looking at the IPCC report that was published in 2018, which basically sketched pathways to mitigating global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Richard just told us that even that level of warming is really too much for the African continent, because it's just an average, right? It's not that everywhere you have that kind of warming. And so, 1.5 degrees Celsius is an ambitious goal, but it's not a goal that one should easily discount as being too ambitious. So what do the models tell us? Well, on the left-hand side here, you see what these models say, how the world is operating in income per capita space, one indicator of economic development, and in energy demand per capita space. So the energy any person explicitly and implicitly uses while caring for themselves and their loved ones and going to work and generating this GDP per capita, this income. So you can think of any point in these spaces on the left-hand side for the world, on the right-hand side for the Middle East and Africa, as showing, where the world or this region, which includes the Middle East, there's no more granular data available, where they are at a certain point in time. And the black trajectory here shows how the world as a whole operated since 1950 all the way to more or less the present. Data stops in 2014 for this particular paper. So basically you see that the world has grown GDP per capita. It has also grown its energy per capita consumption. Now, if you go further to the right, that means you grow your GDP per capita. If you go up, you use more energy per capita. What can we see in both plots? Well, historically, both measures went up together. And then you see these blue lines and a bunch of spaghetti lines, which is all the scenarios. There's actually 90 that explain how the world could work with stringent climate change mitigation. But let's look at the blue lines, which are called the archetypical pathways. They're supposed to be representative of all scenarios. They go to the right, but they actually don't go up, right? So more GDP per capita, the world gets richer, but no more energy consumption. And in fact, they don't only just go right, but almost all of them actually drop, okay? The energy per capita consumption falls. And when does it fall? It's like Richard's trial, it's happening now. So maybe that's good, but I'm not sure in this particular case the saying applies. So the drop is happening from 2020 to 2030. Basically now, as we're speaking, right? And dramatically so. You can see here that some of the more extreme scenarios suggest the world should almost cut a third of its final energy consumption, which is a more stringent measure than primary energy. So far, so good. Maybe behind these aggregates, there's rich countries completely changing how they operate and buying lots of electric vehicles and cutting down on consumption. Actually, no. It turns out, and that's what this paper is a critique of, that even the poorest in terms of GDP per capita regions of the world are supposed to be as flexible as the global average, okay? But we have just seen, if you permit me to go back, that, I'm not saying development is synonymous with the Chinese trajectory, but nobody can deny that China is doing a pretty good job at growing its GDP per capita, okay? And what's China doing? Well, it's far above the global average, which is sitting down here and includes all these rich countries which consume a lot of energy, okay? But the models as a whole say, well, look, sorry, everybody has to cut energy consumption to levels on the African continent in the Middle East, which on average actually pushes up the average because of the OPEC member states also in Northern Africa that tend to have fairly high energy consumption thanks to the structure of their economy. That it's supposed to fall in Africa to below levels that same literature often calls a minimum for decent lives, okay? So this is in the IPCC 2018. I'm eagerly awaiting the new report with the new integrated assessment models that have these economic models in them that's supposed to come out next year. Also eagerly awaiting whether this paper is being cited there. But basically what we're seeing here is a crass assumption about the ability of the African continent to somehow extremely successfully, much more successfully than in the past, right, Africans are getting rich in these scenarios. It's great. But to achieve this while achieving unprecedented declines in energy demand, and therefore somehow manage to generate all this prosperity in some other way. Okay, so that leads me to the last part of my presentation, which contains some suggestions for rethinking economics. Well, it turns out that it is the economic growth models that are embedded in these integrated assessment models that also look at the climate and at land use and at all sorts of other things. But there is a growth model, which you will know from your economics class. It's basically a solo model with an endogenous savings rate. And, the agents, these representative agents, one for each region, they optimize, and that's what you get. They optimize conditional on a carbon price that discourages energy use. It turns out that these models are the same for every region. There are small parameter changes and of course differences in initial conditions, but that's it. So unfortunately, these models are a misrepresentation, and I think Richard's examples, they don't need any more elaboration of the real challenges in the global South and on the African continent in particular. And on top of that, not only are they that, they also are conducive to a fallacy of composition related to decoupling. These models suggest that every continent can decouple economic growth from resource use, in this case, energy use, and of course from CO2 emissions. There are many ways to reduce CO2 emissions, such as switching to clean energy. But these models suggest that the royal way to climate change mitigation is actually to decouple from energy use, which is, however, as development economics and historical data tell us, crucial for economic development. So unfortunately, this can also have consequences for policy discussions, because make no mistakes, these models are the most impactful input into how the world thinks about how to mitigate climate change, right? It's the IPCC, it gets a lot of attention, but somewhere in this beautiful work by a lot of scientists sit these economic models, and they suggest that a continent like Africa should be treated like, for instance, Western Europe or Japan or North America in depicting its economy, which, another example from Richard, is 80% in the informal sector, right? I think that already says a lot.
2 minutes left.
2 minutes left, yeah. So, so what should we do? Well, of course, one can build slightly different growth models, and they exist, that actually bring out the very material differences in economic environments and constraints. I'm just going to say the word structural macroeconomics here. But also, and this leads me to my last 2 points, and I'm happy to elaborate on that in the discussion, it would be interesting to have a more broader framework that thinks about some of these issues as a challenge of fast structural change in an uneven world. A lot of the models are single sector, there is no structural change, but actually going from the informal to the formal sector, going from one sort of energy to another is all about structural change. Some parts of the economy, of the society, have to grow, to increase, and fast, right? That's a key word here, not just evolutionary, and others have to decline fast. And that naturally brings up a bunch of distributional questions, because if something declines, somebody loses out, right? For instance, the fossil fuel industry or the people employed there, or the informal sector employers, and somebody gains. So naturally, by switching to a structural change framework, one brings up very important distributional issues that I think economists have a lot to say about if they only turn their attention to it and not just focused on efficient pathways. Thank you.
Thanks, Gregor. And I think you did an excellent job of kind of illustrating the inequalities that Richard started to talk about and the ways in which they permeate into our economic models, and the way that that can often be taken for granted in science, especially because they look so complicated. And so kind of really unpacking what a lot of these models kind of smooth over, and the kind of inherent inequalities that they represent. So thanks for that. I will now pass on to Tyler. Tyler, you've got 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Katrina. So I would like to start off with maybe just introducing some of the work I've been involved in, which is more on the youth activist and youth advocacy side, specifically within policy. And I think I bring it back to a bit of what Richard was talking about in the beginning and how youth can be and are currently involved in climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. So maybe to give a brief overview, so I'm part of the Youth Policy Committee and I'm leading the Climate Change Working Group, where basically we're one of the, and I think potentially the only like policy-focused youth groups in South Africa. We convene quite a big network of various different organizations with our main focus is upskilling other young people in understanding and contributing to policy and further engaging with government and business on what they actually want policies to look like. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the African peer review mechanism and the South African youth contribution, or the climate change bit of it that I was able to contribute to. And then briefly on the climate advocacy report done by SIA last year. And then I'd like to end off with my work on the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan, which is then now formed part of or led into the South African Youth Climate Action Plan. Okay, so I'll start off with the Youth Climate Advocacy in Africa Guide. So some of this paper was basically led by the South African Institute of International Affairs, being a think tank, looking at the youth climate advocacy in Africa. So I think they profiled about 10 countries, it might be a little bit less, with young researchers, myself being one of them, looking at a specific country and giving some, doing some research and also offering insights and lessons learned into what these countries were saying and what was happening in terms of how youth are actually able to engage with advocacy efforts and policy within the country and the different types of, obviously, different types of activism. So some of the key lessons learned that came from that paper were networking and collaboration and how young people are currently doing this, what's the best practice for it, and how and what sort of support they would need to further their efforts. One of the key ones that I've been seeing across my activism is the need for education, capacity building, and skills development, and realizing that young people don't not know anything. They just need that support in connecting what their lived experiences are to what their education and what their understanding of terms like climate change are saying. Then we also have, obviously, something I'm very passionate about is the policy and policy development and how young people should be involved and can be involved in these different processes, and what it looks like from being tokenistically included for the photo opportunity or for saying we included young people versus actually including young people in the process and taking things back to them and saying, well, you are the future. This is what we want, or this is, we want to hear what you want for your future. And then finally, the last thing that one of the lessons learned that came out was conceptual changes in how we need to change our thinking of how we engage young people and how we engage activists and policy, youth policy activists to a more extent. There are quite a few more, but that's a very brief overview of some of the key outcomes from that paper. Then I'd like to just go into a bit more detail. So the South African APRM, or African Peer Review Mechanism submission, I think it's formally called the SAP Sensitization Project. So there were about 10 different working groups looking at different streams. So I think one was like land and housing, another one was economic opportunities, one was like international agreements, but I obviously naturally found my space in the climate change working group, where we did some research of the effects of climate change, who's impacted, what's currently happening. And the main part of the document was then the recommendations. So I've only put forward 3. There were quite a few that have come up from that paper that the group contributed to, but I've put up 2 here and then one on the next slide. That I'd just like to read to you to show how young people are seeing the impacts of climate change on economy and what needs to actually happen in terms of our future and what needs to be done and how we visualize action being taken. So one is corporates need to be more accountable for their contribution to environmental degradation and should place more emphasis on the reduction of unnecessary production and consumption patterns. The next one, government must increase investments and financing for sustainable and adaptive solutions for local business and offer spaces in a transformed green economy for environmentally conscious, community and youth-driven entrepreneurship ventures. This will ensure the needs of communities are met while simultaneously creating sustainable employment and boosting local economies. So maybe to pause and unpack that, we're clearly calling for better production and consumption patterns and realizing that while individuals do have a big role to play in climate action, we also need to tackle things where there are the system where it's being started, and that's at the high level of corporations and business, and your big energy industries, transport industries, the leaders in those fields, to push them to change their practices. Because we realize in the African context, not everyone has the option and capability to say, well, I can't buy that product because it's environmentally damaging. It's either you can buy that product. It's an economic, we know Africa's economic situation and how people, there's a huge social inequality and economic inequality. And so you can't dictate to people, well, you have to avoid these products because they're environmentally damaging, when in the first place, they can't actually afford to put food on their table consistently for every meal of the day. So we realize that there needs to be more pressure on that side to help consumers make these transitions. And obviously that should be accompanied by stricter and well-enforced policy for pushing these ideas forward. And then the other one is I'd like to pull on that local business and community youth and youth-driven, and that we realize youth have this huge potential. As Richard already mentioned, is that African youth population is about 60%. We have basically the largest, youngest population to have ever existed. Coming up and within the next few years. So we really need to make sure we're harnessing that youth dividend and making sure it's making an impact and not resulting in the situation we're currently seeing in the country, which is like a 30% youth unemployment rate. So we definitely see the green economy and sustainable development opportunities in supporting young people and having young people use that as a way to take climate action. And also making sure that vulnerable and marginalized communities are not left behind in the process. Then one of the other ones that I'd highlight is awareness on recycling, upcycling, and repurposing initiatives should be enhanced to establish waste as a commodity and potential source of household income. This will further reduce the burden of waste in landfills and pollution of global water sources. A first step in ensuring this is formalizing and registering existing waste pickers so that their valuable role to society is recognized and rewarded. So maybe also just going back to that is an informal sector, but it plays a huge role in South Africa's recuperation of resources and that economic value of it. And right now, we're slowly starting to see a mindset change of how big their value is and how big that value of waste, recycling and upcycling and repurposing and its flow into the circular economy has on our development and the value of incorporating such informal sectors in our projected and further development as a country and as a continent. Then, okay, breather. So this, that was the South African APRM Popular Sensitization Project. Now, something I'm very connected to because it was something that was youth-led, youth-driven, and supported and showed deep and meaningful youth policy engagement. And that was the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan. So basically, the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan, you can find it in the city of Johannesburg's actual climate action plan that was released a month or two ago. And as young people, we wrote a section of the document that now features under the Chapter 6, which is mobilizing stakeholders, where we wrote what our future looks like, what it should look like, and what principles are going to underpin that. So the key ones that we brought out were intersectionality, systemic change, community-focused, just transition, innovation, accessibility, and sustainability. So some of the key things that we're asking for is that youth are included in these spaces and that any approach to climate action and climate adaptation or mitigation, it needs to be underpinned and incorporative of these various different principles. So the work of the Joburg YCAP has since built into something much bigger, which is the first ever South African Youth Climate Action Plan, which I'm currently working on as a project lead. So right now, we're in the editing phase. We've been conducting this process since March this year. We've hosted a number of workshops, a number of national meetings and conferences, and we're currently in the editing phase of the document where we're synthesizing all these inputs we got from young people, from participating high schools, out of school youth, university level youth, in terms of what they want their future to look like and what they think youth and climate action, or youth engagement in climate action in general, what climate action should look like. So the key, what we're calling them is pillars that have come up are advocacy and activism, intersectionality, good governance, systemic transformation, and environmental sustainability. So under advocacy and activism, we've pulled on principles of awareness and communication and how we communicate climate change and climate science, and also the climate policy aspect of people, because how can people comment on policy and advocate for better policy implementation if they can't understand it in the first place? I think anyone that's tried to sit down with the NDC, for example, there's lots of big words, a lot of things happening, the structure's not very clear, or any policy document in that case. And so we're asking and calling for better clarity and more programs that are including that in the climate literacy and climate awareness space. Then two of the other key groups are the community and civil society engagement, and then the youth engagement aspect, ensuring that any climate action is inclusive of communities and does not leave them behind, but realizing that they have this huge potential to be drivers of change. But sometimes there's just some things lacking, like maybe it's an education or access to resources, or maybe their location doesn't typically give them access to different opportunities, and how do we support these opportunities coming to these areas? And then obviously—
2 more minutes, Tyler. Sorry.
Cool. Thank you. And then obviously education is something I've touched on already. Under good governance, we've got leadership and governance, we've got accountability and transparency, both on the part of government, but also on the part of business and civil society, and how these different aspects play together and how we need those to ensure climate action is actually worthwhile in saying something. Under the environmental sustainability, we've got the use of natural resources, oceans and land biodiversity, and agriculture and food systems, and how we best need to preserve these and ensure that they're equipped to handle climate change, but also reducing their impacts on and for climate change. And then the principle I'm probably most passionate about is the systemic transformation. So we currently have quite a few different sub-pillars or principles under that. And the main one that's come up is a decarbonized economy and the just transition, and ensuring that while we're moving away from energy, we also need to be mindful of the people and the economic situation of people in South Africa, and ensuring that there's those incentives and the policy mechanisms enabling that, but also supporting and not leaving people behind. Another key one is sustainable industries, and how sectors such as agriculture, energy, transport, liquid fuels, mining, and forestry all need to be included and have some sort of action plan in terms of their climate change commitments. Then obviously a big one is sustainable energy, and we've touched on this quite a bit today, and that we need to shift to renewable energies and make sure we stop investing and divest from the fossil fuel industry. And then we've got sustainable, I'm almost done. We have sustainable human settlements, and basically looking at how we can make sure our cities are sustainable, what infrastructure is needed, how do we go back and update the existing infrastructure we have, and further, how do we ensure new developments meet green goals, but also knowing that while a large proportion of the world's population are going to live in urban areas, in the South African context, we still have a huge proportion of people living in informal settlements. So how do we make sure that those spaces become green and sustainable and are not left behind while we're proposing economic transformation through climate action? And then one of the last points is the circular economy and waste management, and how the circular economy is this great opportunity to take action on climate change and make sure all these different stakeholders are included and that we meet in the middle. So I think let me end it there, but that's an overview of the Youth Climate Action Plan. We're going to be launching it at the start of October. So if you want to have more read or have a look, you can Google South African Youth Climate Action Plan and visit the webpage. I think it's linked to SIA's website to have a look there. I can even drop the link in the chat box for you. But yeah, I hope you can stay engaged and follow the rest of the progress.
Thanks so much, Tyler. And yeah, please do share the link in the chat. I think that'll be great for some of our participants. So thanks to the panel. I think you kind of each touched on a really different perspective of the problem, of the question, but in ways that we could kind of see the connections between the different perspectives that you're coming from. So I think there was something there for everyone. I'm now going to open up the floor to some questions. We've already got a few in the Q&A function. So if I can ask the panelists to please turn their videos back on, just because it would be nice to see everybody. So the first question, I will kind of do them one by one, because I think otherwise it can be quite overwhelming. There are two questions directed, I think, at Richard. The first one asks, does sustainable climate action require at least partial delinking from the global economy in order to move away from extractivism, develop and establish food sovereignty? And then another one maybe, how do you change the mindsets of people, like you suggested, that we need alongside policy change?
Thank you very much for those questions. And the reality is, let me start by saying this. Africa doesn't exist in space. And Africa cannot delink itself from what is happening in the global community. But the reality is that Africa's context, what I always say, context matters. The contextual reality of African challenges are quite very unique. And therefore, the solutions in moving towards a low emission pathway have to be contextualized within the African context, because the challenges are different from elsewhere. So what's my point? Africa needs to decarbonize and transition. Actually, as we're talking today, there is a debate on just transition. And what that means for Africa is that Africa, as I said, the reason why Africa is so vulnerable is because of the low socioeconomic base in which it is starting, and therefore people cannot afford the services and the goods to build resilient systems to be able to cope with these emergencies. Either it's health emergency or economic emergency or climate emergency. And more importantly, just to state one fact here is, and I think Gregor said this very clearly, it is projected that energy decarbonization in line with an average of 2 degrees world scenario will result in net energy savings of 7 trillion in just about 2050. And this is part of an effort towards net zero emissions. So what's the point here? These are going to be opportunities that Africa needs to tap into, and Africa cannot disengage itself, because we're talking about total annual energy investments towards energy carbonization that are going to be huge here. And so Africa needs to leverage on that, and leverage in a way that can benefit people who are disengaged from the opportunities at the moment. Like Africa leapfrog from landlines to cell phones. Africa can actually leapfrog at the moment to then renewable energy that can reach people in communities to be able to start addressing not only electricity issue, but also value addition. That is how we can be able to move. On the one of mindsets, the reality is this. I always say that if you tell a hungry child that you gave him or her food yesterday, that means nothing to that child. That child is hungry at that moment and he or she needs food. That then means we must then be able to change our narrative of problem to a narrative of opportunities. That the challenges we face are disguised opportunities. That if we are able to engage our youth and retool their skills and support them, they can then start to turn a climate challenge. Either it is waste that is being turned to briquettes, or helping them to fabricate simple solar dryer that can help solve a problem. When we start to drive a narrative of opportunities, people will rally around it and they will become the implementers of that. But at the moment, it's a narrative of problems. It's a narrative of complaining sometimes, but we do not communicate opportunities with the same energy that we communicate problems. Thank you. Thanks,
Richard, for responding to those questions. I'll now move on to two questions directed, I think, at Gregor. And they basically relate to the question of decoupling. So the first asks, In general, is decoupling even possible? Decoupling from greenhouse gas emissions is only enough to avoid climate change, not other types of ecological disaster. And then the next one asks, I'll just summarize it slightly. Based on your presentations, I wonder where this leaves industrialization efforts in Africa. The inputs for major technologies, including clean tech, are dependent on cheap resources from Africa. So if we industrialize on a path similar to China, we fail to decouple for economic growth from energy, but gain better benefits from the resources we have. Can one provocatively understand this discussion to imply that if we do decouple, is it fair to assume we remain locked as a site of cheap extraction, as is the status quo, and simply build economies which can survive devastation of extreme weather events, which are by now a foregone conclusion in the near future? I think that might actually be for everyone, but Gregor, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. Great and difficult questions. I mean, to lead, I just wanted to say that I was perhaps a bit silent on, what are the alternatives? It's not about decoupling from energy, the whole climate change challenge. It's about decoupling from carbon emissions, and you can decouple from carbon emissions while increasing energy demand if that energy demand is met with clean supply, right? So the punchline in the paper is that you need a faster switch in the energy mix. And that replies to some of that first question, perhaps, about decoupling. I admit that I'm not an expert in all of these domains of planetary limits that we're running into. But I think, let me put the economist hat on here and say that typically flexible economies are pretty good at finding ways out of a crisis by changing how things are going. And capitalist economies have been proven, to be remarkably resilient to all sorts of challenges, including to the whole system. And we still live in a capitalist global economy that's perhaps more dominant than ever before. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are ways to adapt to all of these challenges. But how does it look for people on the ground? I'm not so sure about that. To give an extreme example, will it be a space station for a few people and misery for everybody else? That's not an outcome that one would want, right? So there has been some decoupling, but it's terrible for a lot of people. So I think, yeah, that's really the big elephant in the room. And some people say, well, the only way we can do that is to degrow, right? There, I think the discussion is still developing, but I think one thing is clear, that this degrowth can only be confined to countries that have grown a lot in the past. And it's not a discussion that is particularly applicable to most people in Africa. I think it's a good question, and it's a question that'll be with us throughout the 21st century and beyond. But hopefully, in the meantime, there are good strategies that are not informed by models that misrepresent part of the world and how it can cope with the challenges. And then we're sorry a few years later because the strategies that were devised somehow didn't materialize, and everybody sort of, we need to do more. But more of what is the question? The second question, that's a great one. Typically extractive industries are actually quite energy and material intensive themselves. So if Africa remains a source of raw materials for the rest of the world, I'm not sure how that can be squared with decoupling. Decoupling typically operates when you switch to the service sector, like that is done in deindustrializing economies, such as in Europe and in Northern America. So I'm not sure if even that particular thing is thought through in these models, because they do not usually model. I mean, they have to do a lot of things, and they're aggregate models, so they cannot model everything. But one question that is typically not answered in most of these models is, where do the raw materials come from, right? And unless they model trade between regions on a commodity by commodity basis, this question, I think, is left unanswered. But I would say, yes, the best path forward for Africa at this macro level, without understanding all the details, some of which the other panelists raised, would be to strive for industrialization, create these investment opportunities, and provide raw materials both for other continents if it's profitable, but also for domestic industries.
Thanks, Gregor. I think that was a very comprehensive answer to a very difficult question. Tyler, I'm going to move on to you, and feel free to also comment on any of the other questions, as well as the ones I'm kind of directing at you. So one we got from an attendee is, where do we draw the line between individual responsibility and change at the macro level with regard to climate change? And then, if I may, I will also pop one of my own questions in, which is something that we haven't really touched on in this session, is the gender dimension. And I know this is something that I think you've worked on before, and kind of, I guess the question is, how do we include gendered understandings, that we understand that the world is gendered, the role of women into kind of climate policy, but particularly in a circumstance at the moment where women in South Africa have been hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you so much. Both very great questions. So on the first one is, where do we draw the line? I think it's very difficult to draw an actual line. It's basically to do as much as you can as an individual, but recognizing that you can't donate, you can't volunteer, you can't spend your weekends volunteering, you can't eat vegan, completely switch to a plant-based diet. It's a lot of work for one people. If you have the capacity and power to do so, you should. But I think the biggest bit is knowing and understanding your impact on the environment and knowing how your actions are taking shape. So even just doing one climate friendly thing a week. So saying, okay, on Monday I eat plant-based, on Tuesday I rather cycle or walk to work than drive my car if you have that opportunity. But on the same hand, in South Africa, it's very difficult to say, well, you have to take public transport, when public transport as a woman as well is not very safe in the first place. So there's a lot of different dimensions. I think the biggest impact we're going to see in terms of climate action is definitely at the level of corporations and at the macro level. So that's one, better policy implementation, and then further better action and legislation and strict enforcement on the part of corporations or towards corporations, and ensuring that they're making better options available for consumers, because it's all fair to say, well, consumers must just boycott. But I mean, some people don't have that opportunity to boycott. So I think there's a big need for like producers like Coca-Cola. They have the funding, they have the opportunity to make better alternatives available, but they're not doing it. And it's kind of a catch-22. Who must push them? The consumers almost be internally driven, and it definitely needs to be something that's forcing them, that's not only consumers. Because at the end of the day, something I've heard before is your vote is where you buy. And if you continue buying and supporting these things and economic or environmentally friendly businesses, you're contributing to it. But then there's also the African context is not everyone has that option to just say, okay, well, I can't buy that product because they're damaging, which is something I touched on earlier. Then in terms of the gender dimension, it's a very important discussion that's happening. So at COP25, when I was there, I was involved in the gender negotiations for the Lima Work Program on Gender and its Gender Action Plan. And something we're definitely seeing and we're definitely acknowledging at the policy level is how women are impacted by climate change, and how, while we're seeing that they're impacted by COVID, it's going to be probably the same or worse in terms of how they're going to be impacted by from COVID to climate change, in that we know women are the first ones. If there's water shortages, they're the ones that have to leave school early to go collect municipal water. They're the ones that are involved in the farming. They're the ones that are staying home, that are raising the children, that are all doing all these different things. And the normal roles or the roles assigned to women for many, many years, which women are also one trying to break out of, but they're the immediately and first, they're the front line of climate change. And I think in terms of addressing this and supporting this is one, education, skills and capacity building. But we also need to recognize that you need to teach people where they're at, because for many women and many young girls, they have to drop out of school much earlier than their male counterparts. So you need to ensure that any education and skills is talking to what they know in their lived experience. And then the other thing is researching and having better informed ideas of what their experiences actually are, so that the policies and implementations and strategies can actually inform what they need. Because it's not right to say, well, we think women need this, when we haven't actually done the research saying that women actually need this, or this is what communities need here, and that it should be fit for purpose, because for women in one area of South Africa might not be the exact same context as another area of South Africa. So one might be experiencing flooding, where another one will be experiencing significant drought where they were a farming community. So I think there's definitely a lot of research still needed in terms of communities and across the board in the country to improve our state of gender and recognition. And that whole gender discussion is a whole nother thing of how we're inclusive of gender and women in policy making, and making sure that they're not only represented at lower levels, but also at the decision-making space.
Thanks, Tyler. And yeah, I think you're right that kind of the question of gender is not limited to climate change, and certainly permeates kind of every aspect of South African society and policy making. So next question to Richard. This is actually to all the panelists, but I thought Richard might have an interesting response to this. What is your view on payments for loss and damage already experienced due to climate impacts? Is this something that African countries need to be pushing for? Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. A good question. The reality is that is part of the negotiation of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. There is what is called the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage. But this is my argument on this. Based on experience, yes, countries have to be supported and given what is agreed on the international mechanism. But my point is this. If you look at what I said earlier, the reason why Africa is so vulnerable, I mean, it's not just Africa that faces calamities like hurricanes and cyclones. As we're speaking today, the United States is actually facing a hurricane that is causing damage. But when Africa witnessed Cyclone Idai and Kenneth in Southern Africa in 2019, what happened? Over 600 lives lost, infrastructure and property destroyed up to 3 billion. What is my point here? If people are not socio-economically empowered, even if you give them early warning, they will not be able to move. Where will they move to? Where will they have the means to move to? So the compensation for loss and damage, that money should be injected into areas that can actually be able to help empower people, and at the same time also drive socio-economic opportunities. So compensation or not will not change anything that much if the money doesn't go, because as I said earlier, Africa is already contributing 20% of the adaptation needs in the continent from national budget. But where is the money going to? It's mostly for social endeavors, but that money needs to be leveraged as an investment opportunity. So climate action should be seen as an investment opportunity. So the issue is not just about compensation, which is a yes, but it's about when compensated, where should the resources be invested so that socio-economic resilience of communities can be built, leverage local structure. And I'd like to use that to touch the aspect on gender, which as Tello did answer this. One of the aspects is, in addition to gender inclusion, one of the biggest inclusion is also to focus in areas where the bulk of the community is involved, agriculture. 80% of the food that is produced in Africa is mostly produced by women. They need to be climate proofed. They need to be supported. And if we want to really ensure gender inclusivity, we should actually channel investment into areas where the bulk of the women are actually engaged, and that is in agriculture. Can we be able to provide input and support into communal cooperatives where they can access at low interest rate or zero interest rate? Can we then be able to engage young people to devise input, whether it is biofertilizer or solar dryer, so that it can address the challenges of post-harvest losses that they are facing? Unless the debate moves beyond just policy and now actually to implementation, we might be in for a very long haul.
Thanks, Richard, for that response. We are running out of time, but there's one last question that's been unanswered, and I think this is for Gregor. Do the scenarios for reduced emissions with growth contain large-scale speculative carbon sequestration technologies? And I guess, kind of to elaborate on that a little bit, kind of what are your thoughts on this carbon sequestration kind of in general, if I may ask that?
Sure. Yeah, they do. All but one scenario in this spaghetti plot I showed you do. And the one that doesn't has a very, very steep energy decline. It's called the low energy demand scenario. LED is one of the archetypical ones, where they actually tried to save so much energy that you don't need sequestration. Now, there's actually an effort to reduce the reliance on carbon capture and sequestration in the next generation of models, some of which may come out next year. I'm not sure if it's in the IPCC report, because there have been critiques that reliance on this unproven technology is not a good strategy to sketch the future. At the same time, you know, I'm not so confident that without attempts to capture a lot of carbon, we, in quotation marks, the world economy is going to reduce emissions anywhere fast enough to meet these stringent carbon budgets that we know now are associated with certain global warming. So I think it's a good idea to try as hard as possible by that, you know, don't lay all your eggs in one basket. Try it. Does it work? Great. If it doesn't work, well, hopefully you have some other aces up your sleeve, right? I mean, these ideas about reforesting everything everywhere and solve it all with BECCS, with bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration, I think has been shown that it's kind of a very strong assumption because you may need the land for other uses. But there's direct air capture now, technologies that probably play some role. How big is the role? We don't know yet, it's uncertain. But just if you want to know more of the details about this, this analysis in the paper and you want to read the paper, I've seen someone write this and you can't access it because your university or you just don't have access to it, just email me. You know, academics usually love to share their work. This is a general advice. If you can't access academic papers, just email the authors politely and they'll probably reply within a day. So yeah, and just the last shout out on gender and other, you know, issues that concern inequalities between groups in society. When I said distributional issues, you know, I really mean at all levels and between all sorts of groups. So gender inequality is also a really important concern that needs to be addressed. And I loved the contributions from both panelists on that.
Thanks for wrapping that up so nicely, Gregor. We have come to the end of the session. I want to thank all of the attendees, all of the panelists. I'm sorry, I saw a couple more questions come in, but we won't be able to attend to those. I think you all did fantastic inputs that really spoke to each other remarkably well. So thank you for giving your time. Thank you to the participants for giving their time and for providing such excellent questions to spark our discussion. I would encourage all of you to check out some of the other sessions that are happening later today and then tomorrow afternoon and evening. It really does. I think you'll be surprised at how much of the topics that we've been discussing today really feature across the economy. And I think it illustrates just how pervasive kind of the issue of climate is. So thank you, everyone. And for those in South Africa, have a good evening. And for those in the rest of the world, have a great day. Bye.
Bye, thank you.